Samyaza didn't vanish. He didn't die. He didn't disappear from existence. He is still there, somewhere, aware, conscious, trapped. And that alone creates a question most people never think deeply about. If God has absolute power, why is Samyaza still existing at all? Not why he fell, not what he did, but why hasn't it all simply ended? Because if God wanted it finished, it would be finished. So what is stopping it? Or more importantly, what are we misunderstanding about how divine judgment actually works? Stay with this question, because everything you think you know about punishment, power, and evil starts to break the moment you try to answer it. Chapter 1. The moment heaven stopped being simple. This didn't begin with chaos, it began with certainty. Samyaza wasn't confused. The angels who followed him weren't lost. They weren't tricked. They were aware of what they were doing. That's what makes it dangerous. Because rebellion in ignorance is one thing, but rebellion with understanding is something else entirely. There was a decision made in heaven that changed everything, to cross a boundary that could not be crossed twice. They looked at creation below, at humanity, at earth, at limitation, and something shifted inside them. Not corruption at first, but dissatisfaction. And from that dissatisfaction came leadership. Samyaza became the center of alignment. Others followed not because they were forced, but because the idea itself felt convincing. That's where the first real fracture formed, because heaven wasn't attacked from the outside. It was challenged from within. And here is where the question starts to sharpen. If this was seen, if this was known in the realm of absolute authority, why was it allowed to reach the point where it could actually happen? Because at some point they didn't just think about rebellion, they acted, they descended. And once that movement began, something irreversible occurred. They stepped outside the structure they were created to remain inside. Not physically at first, but in alignment. And that is the part most people miss. Because in this story, the fall is not just a location change, it is a state change. They moved from order into defiance. And once that shift completed, they were no longer angels in heaven making a mistake. They became something else entirely, a contradiction still in motion, which leads to the tension that cannot be ignored. If God is truly all-powerful, then nothing about this event was unknown. So the real question becomes unavoidable. Was this rebellion something that slipped past divine control, or something that was permitted long enough to reveal its full shape? Because the moment Samyaza led them down, the story stopped being about failure and started becoming about what happens after a line is crossed that cannot be undone. And that is where everything begins to move toward the real mystery. Not the fall, but what comes after it is allowed to fully exist. Chapter 2. Why they were not erased. When Samyaza and the others crossed the line, the expectation, at least from a human perspective, is immediate deletion. End it, erase it, undo it. But that is not what happens. Instead, something far more unsettling appears. Containment. They are not described as destroyed. They are not described as gone. They are described as bound. That detail alone changes the entire tone of the story, because if destruction had happened instantly, there would be no question left. But imprisonment means something different is going on. It means they still exist, still aware, still present in some form, still under judgment. Now the question becomes sharper. Why preserve them at all? Because power in its absolute form does not need to struggle. It does not need to negotiate. It does not need to delay. So if they are still existing, it cannot be because they escaped attention. It must be because their condition is part of something already decided. And this is where the idea of chains of darkness matters. This is not language of death. It is a language of restriction, of motion being removed without existence being removed. They are not interacting with the world anymore. They are not shaping events anymore, but they are still conscious of what they lost. And that creates something more severe than punishment through force. It becomes punishment through awareness. Now pause on this thought. If they were erased instantly, the rebellion ends as an event. But if they are contained while still aware, the rebellion becomes a continuing state of consequence. And that raises the central contradiction again. If God could end them completely, why leave them existing in any form at all? Because at this point, it is no longer about stopping what they did. It is about what their existence represents after what they did. And whatever that reason is, it is strong enough to keep beings who once stood in heaven itself from being simply removed. So they remain, not free, not finished, not forgotten, but held in place, inside something that feels less like delay and more like preparation for something that has not yet reached its final moment. Chapter 3. Buried but still aware. The language used about them is not subtle: chains, darkness, binding. But none of it describes an end. It describes restriction without removal. And that difference is where the discomfort begins. Because what gets buried here is not their bodies. It is their access. Access to movement, access to influence, access to the world they once touched, but not access to awareness. They are still conscious, still thinking, still remembering what they were before the fall. And that memory does not fade. It sharpens, because they now exist in contrast, what they were versus what they are. Now here is the part that changes everything. If punishment were simply about removal, awareness would not be necessary. But awareness remains, which means the condition itself is part of the judgment, not an accident of it. So they are not asleep in darkness. They are contained inside awareness with no direction outward, no bodies to act, no space to escape into, no progression forward, only consciousness looping against the reality of confinement. And this leads to the unsettling implication. They are not waiting for punishment, they are already inside it. Now ask the question that sits under everything. Why allow them to remain aware at all? Because awareness is not neutral here. It becomes part of the weight. They remember heaven clearly. They remember authority. They remember what it felt like to exist in alignment. And now that memory does something different. It doesn't comfort them. It contrasts them. And contrast becomes torment when there is no way back to resolution. So what looks like imprisonment is actually something more precise. A state where existence continues, but resolution is permanently removed, which is why their condition feels unfinished. Because it is not designed to feel complete. It is designed to hold them in the exact moment where understanding is total. But freedom is permanently absent. And that is where the real question sharpens again. If God is capable of ending anything instantly, then why design something that continues awareness instead of removing it? Because whatever this is, it is not simply punishment. It is structured consequence. And structured consequence does not behave like quick destruction. It behaves like something that must remain in place until everything it represents is fully accounted for. Chapter 4. The real reason they were not destroyed. At this point, the obvious answer stops working. Because if this was only about stopping rebellion, it could have ended immediately. No delay, no imprisonment, no continuation, just removal. But that is not what the narrative shows. Instead, they are kept in a state that preserves existence, awareness, and consequence at the same time. So the question changes shape. It is no longer, why hasn't God ended them? It becomes, what requires them to still exist? And that is where the deeper logic appears. Because destruction ends evidence. It removes the subject entirely, but containment does something different. It preserves the outcome in a controlled state, not for their benefit, but for what their existence represents. Samyaza's rebellion was not small enough to disappear quietly. It involved knowledge, choice, and leadership. It wasn't random corruption, it was structured defiance. And structured defiance creates something that cannot simply be erased without context. Because if it disappears instantly, it becomes an incomplete story. Rebellion without visible consequence, action without observable justice, violation without full exposure of result. But if it is allowed to unfold fully and then contained, something else happens. The nature of rebellion becomes fully revealed. Not just what they did, but what rebellion becomes when it reaches its limit. So their continued existence is not about mercy, and it is not about weakness, it is about completeness. Because judgment, in this framework, is not just about stopping evil. It is about making evil fully defined. And once something is fully defined, it cannot be misunderstood later as something accidental or partial. That is the key difference. Now, the uncomfortable implication: if they were simply erased, the story ends early. But by keeping them in existence, the story stays open long enough for its meaning to be fully established, which means their current state is not an interruption of justice. It is part of how justice is finalized. And this leads to a question that cannot be ignored. If their existence is serving a purpose beyond their rebellion, then the real question is not why they are still here, but what final point their continued existence is leading toward. Because nothing in this structure feels random. Even silence, even delay, even containment, everything points forward. Chapter 5, the silence that feels like waiting. What makes this story disturbing is not what is happening, it's what is not happening. No movement, no escalation, no visible end. Just silence surrounding beings who once stood in the presence of God. Samyaza and the fallen angels are not described as acting anymore. They are described as contained. And containment introduces something most people underestimate: time that no longer leads anywhere. Because normal time moves toward change, but their condition does not. It holds. And when time holds, awareness becomes the only thing left that moves. Thoughts continue. Memory continues. Understanding continues. But nothing external responds. And that creates a specific kind of pressure. Not physical pain, but unresolved existence. Now here is the core tension. If they are already judged, why does anything continue at all? Because if judgment was only about removal, this stage would not exist. But instead, what we see is something that feels suspended. Not unfinished in power, but unfinished in purpose. And that is where the idea of waiting becomes important. Not waiting for escape, not waiting for freedom, but waiting for the completion of something that has already been set in motion. Because everything about their condition suggests this: it is not evolving randomly. It is holding its final shape until a defined point is reached. And that raises the question no one can avoid anymore. What exactly is still unfolding that requires them to remain conscious through it? Because nothing about their state suggests uncertainty. It suggests finality that has not yet been fully expressed. And that is why the silence feels heavy. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything necessary has already been decided, and yet the conclusion is still not visible. So they remain where they are, not active, not erased, not free, but locked inside awareness that cannot progress forward until whatever their existence is tied to reaches its final conclusion. And that leads directly into the last question this story forces you to face. If everything about this judgment is already set, then what is the final moment still waiting to arrive? Chapter 6, the answer hidden in plain sight. By now the question has changed. It's no longer, can God destroy Samyaza and the fallen angels? Because everything you've seen points to one thing: power is not the issue. The real question is, why hasn't he chosen to end them instantly? And the answer is uncomfortable, because it removes the simplicity people expect. They are not still existing because they escaped judgment. They are still existing because judgment is still unfolding in its full form. Not in chaos, not in delay, but in completion. Because instant destruction would close the case too early. It would end the rebellion without fully exposing what rebellion becomes. But what you've seen through this entire story is different. Their fall was allowed to reach consequence. Their actions were allowed to leave impact. And now, their existence is held in a state that preserves both memory and outcome, so that nothing about what happened can ever be misunderstood. And this leads to the final, unavoidable realization. God hasn't failed to destroy them. He has chosen a form of judgment that doesn't end in a moment, but in a complete conclusion. A conclusion where nothing is hidden, nothing is incomplete, nothing can be questioned. And that is why Samyaza still exists, not as a free being, not as a threat moving through the world, but as part of a judgment that is still reaching its final point. And when that point comes, it won't feel like delay anymore. It will feel like everything. Every action, Every consequence, every moment of silence has been leading to one unavoidable end. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think God is delaying their end or completing something we don't fully understand yet? Drop your thoughts in the comments.